Greg, I'm wondering if you could just kind of review the rules not rules, but how we're going to kind of roll the meeting out in the virtual platform.
Sure. This is for all of you who have been to one of these virtual meetings. We're asking you to do the same behaviors. So we ask you now to mute your microphones. We are going to have presenters present for the bulk of the meeting, and we'll take questions at the end. So for the most part, there should be no reason for you to do just that. If you would please mute your microphones, that will eliminate that sort of background noise. Thank you. We will be taking questions.
Charlie, call Grandma. Grandpa's at a meeting. Call Grandma, okay? Bye. Thank you.
And let's see. There we go.
You as a host can mute everyone if you want.
Yep.
We don't want to go that far yet. We do have almost everybody muted, but I will be muting people if they're not muted and they present background noise. So anyway, we'll be taking questions at the end. If you have any questions or comments you wish to make, please put them in the chat box, specifically your name first. If you want to add your question or comment there, that's fine. That's not necessary. We will be taking your questions in order. When we call on you, then you can unmute your mic, make your question, and then mute your mic and wait for a response. And we'll just move through the questions in that format. I think that's pretty much it. So back to Dave. Have an enjoyable meeting.
Okay, thank you. And one of the reasons we're saving questions for the end is because we're recording, we kind of want to get through the presentations and then open it up for Q&A. My name is David Manhart. I'm the Director of Community Development with South Whitehall Township. I'd like to take this opportunity just to introduce our team. We have Greg Adams, the planner for South Whitehall Township. We have Robert Emanuel, an intern with South Whitehall Township from Temple University. We have Hannah Clark with Michael Baker International helping us out with the working groups. Chris Rabasco is also with Michael Baker. And we also have Scott Postersky with Keystone Consulting Engineers is our traffic modeler. And we also have Todd Poole with Forward Planning, who is our fiscal impact modeler. So we'll be hearing from a few of us this evening. And the agenda, whoops, it didn't advance. Oh, there it goes. So tonight, welcome and introductions. So tonight we're going to be providing framing concepts. The idea is these framing concepts will be used to help inform working group decisions and discussions. The framing concepts include guiding principles, the where should we grow exercises, the how should we grow, the development scenario, then fiscal impacts and traffic impacts of that development scenario. All of that gets packaged and delivered to working groups. Hannah will go over the working group approach and proposed schedule. Then we will open it up to Q&A and just some closing remarks after that. This is the process we've been following. So phase one has been existing conditions, guiding principles. We developed the guiding principles during that session. Phase two was the where should we grow exercises. And then phase three was the land use scenario. So that was the how should we grow. And now we're into phase four, where we're forming the subcommittees or working groups. And these working groups will provide recommendations to the Planning Commission for the development of the comprehensive plan. Here are the guiding principles. So one of the things that we're doing is we're preparing workbooks, and the workbooks will have all of this information. for the working groups to kind of consult and use as a resource. That doesn't work. So phase 2 was the where should we grow exercise. So this is the exercise we had, I believe it was 6 sessions at different locations throughout the township where we had the dot exercise, where we asked folks to decide where development should occur and to what density, so the number of dots. And then also we asked participants to put stickers on areas that they felt should be protected, and then also areas that they felt should be improved. While we were conducting that exercise, we did kind of have discussions as we were walking around, and it became apparent that the improvement stickers were primarily related to traffic improvements, and the protection was related to resource protection, historic resource, natural resource, or agricultural resources. So that's kind of where that came from. And then you'll see on the slide here that each hex is designated with a development type, so greenfield, infill, or redevelopment, and then also with a combination of population and employment. So you have, for example, you have a hexagon that is greenfield with low population and low employment. So these were the outputs of the phase 2. I should mention that during the processing of all of the maps that were compiled, we did some statistical analysis to kind of get rid of some outliers and find the averages and standard deviations of the specific hexagons. So it kind of got rid of some of the outliers. If people were, just dumping hex dots on specific hexes, we could kind of take care of that. So that was the where should we grow exercise, and then we built upon that by conducting the how should we grow. So the idea was we had the where, and then we wanted the how. So we conducted a visual preference survey. We had over 600 responses. 580 of those responses were residents, and that number of residents and the method that we distributed made it a statistically valid survey population. So we were able to run some statistics on the survey results. We're in the process of finalizing a document that will present those results in a lot of detail. So I'm not going to go over that in a ton of detail tonight. Just kind of laying the groundwork for how we got to where we are. So in the visual preference survey, each development type and combination, participants were asked, which photograph and description would they most like to see. Here are a few of the choices that were popular with the greenfield. Similar to the infill development types, so these were popular in the infill development type, and then in the redevelopment. So you can see redevelopment, adaptive reuse was probably the most common theme that we saw. And the question kind of becomes, now that we have the where and the how do we put those together into a development scenario? So here's an example just for greenfield. Again, I'm not going into a ton of detail on how we did this, but just to give the idea. So for greenfield development, each hex has a combination. So for example, a hexagon in greenfield that has low, we applied, and whatever photograph was most encouraged. There was a associated density with that photograph. So we applied that density to open space or vacant space or buildable areas within that hex that fit that photograph. So here's some of the greenfield results. Single family dwellings, central green, for greenfield that had some employment, commercial, retail, multi-tenant, context-sensitive architecture, village-type setting. Single-family dwellings, compact arrangements, central green, open space preservation. So these were some of the common themes that came out of the greenfield development types. And then we have a similar thing for the infill development. So you can see the map on the left indicates where that infill development is occurring, or where it was suggested from the Where Should We Grow exercises. Some of the similar descriptions, single family dwelling, village type center. So there's a lot of common themes kind of embedded throughout the survey results. Same for redevelopment. So again, you can see which hexagons were suggested for redevelopment. Adaptive reuse, again, is a popular theme with redevelopment. So we took these combination of the photographs of how with those associated densities and the categories of the where and built out a scenario. It's an estimate. It's kind of a best case scenario based on those results. I wouldn't say best case. It's kind of how we can apply that to the map to develop a scenario. And then that scenario will be evaluated, or has been evaluated, by Todd for the fiscal impact and Scott for the traffic impacts. And then this information will then get transferred to the working groups as a guide to help develop recommendations. So it's not intended to be a end-all be-all scenario. If there are things that come out of this scenario that are negative impacts, we want to know about those, and the working groups can plan accordingly and make recommendations to mitigate those potential impacts or encourage positive impacts. So that's kind of a brief overview of where we are and how we got here. Again, we're going to save questions for the end. I do kind of want to save some time for Todd and Scott because they have the cool piece, the models. And so I think with that, I'll hand it over to Todd.
Thanks, Dave, and good evening, everyone. I never really knew that economics was cool. I thought it was cool and I studied it. So I'm going to share my screen.
Yep.
Give me that option. Let's see here.
Should be good to go.
Yeah. Okay. And you should be all looking at a title screen.
Yes.
Is that correct? All right, super. All right, so what I'm going to do over the next 15 or so minutes is take you through kind of a high level understanding of, one, what is a fiscal impact analysis? Why do we do it? And two, how do we apply it, in this case, to your build out, or a prospective build out according to the How We Grow exercise and your comprehensive plan. So first things first, what is a fiscal impact analysis? if you want to read this is fine, but effectively what we'd like to think of is you have a system. Your system is your community. It is South Whitehall Township. When you introduce something into that system, such as development and people and school children and so on and so forth, you are shocking the system. And shocking sounds, kind of as a negative term, but it is effectively what is happening is that you're introducing something new, and as a result, there are consequences. And there, I won't call them so much as positive, negative, but there are consequences on both sides of the balance sheet. So you introduce development and people, generally you're going to have revenues associated with that, but you're on the other side of the ledger, you're also going to have service costs, right? So you think about a fiscal impact analysis as understanding what those impacts are on net, okay? So we're not simply concerned with one side of the ledger, such as what are the tax revenues, how many people, how many buildings, or on the other side of the ledger, what are the service costs for the schools and the municipality. We want to look at everything in totality and then come up with what we believe to be a net outcome. So that's effectively what we talk about when we talk about fiscal impact analysis. Now, caveats to this, and by the way, I will be providing a little bit more in-depth workbook for the working groups later after this is over, so that you have this as a reference point, and I'll give you a little bit more insight and information about how this works and how you should apply it. But here's something important for you to understand is fiscal impact analysis is not a hard science. I mean, there's some science involved in it, certainly the math that we have to do, but there are also a lot of assumptions that go into this. And as you imagine, assumptions are based on variables and on what might happen in the future. So while we do our best to come up with realistic assumptions based on what we know today, you should not think of this as an exact science, such that if we put in all the projected numbers of housing units and commercial buildings, and we think the tax rate is going to be X and the common level ratio is going to be Y, here's what's going to happen. That would be lovely, but that's just not the way that this works. How it works, however, is that we should put you very much in the ballpark of what you can expect, and think of it as an order of magnitude. You should be able to come away from having a fiscal impact analysis done, which says on net, you're going to be positive, or on net, you might be negative, and by approximately X, with some wiggle room. So that's really what we're talking about when we say, be careful how you interpret things. Here's the other thing, and this is very important, is my firm was asked to look at a fiscal impact analysis associated with a full build out. That is to say that all of the land uses that were identified in the how should we grow exercise, which includes housing and commercial and industrial, and by the way, within those categories, there's different gradations of housing and commercial, right? We put all this into our model, and we said, what does that look like? Well, as we all know, that's probably not, it is not realistic that you would have all of this development occur at one moment in time, right? What happens is something as a comprehensive plan, which is generally speaking in Pennsylvania, something that looks to guide development over at least a 10-year period, and oftentimes it will have influence over a 15 or 20-year period. That's really the realistic time frame for this kind of development to occur. So when I show you these numbers a little bit, understand that this is not real world stuff. It's just, if we said today we dropped all this development down in South Whitehall Township, and that were possible, and given what we know about tax rates and service costs and your current budgets, here's what we believe that would, or what it would look like in terms of impacts. Okay, so here are the metrics we were provided with, and this is based on the how should we grow exercise that many of you participated in. On the left side of your screen, you will see that we've got this broken out into residential and commercial, and further subcategorized into, for residential, for example, single family detached housing units. I'm calling them townhouse units, but think of those as attached single family units. Then we have low-rise multifamily rental units, mid-rise multifamily rental units, and then the corresponding numbers for each one of those categories of dwelling units, adding up to 2,711 housing units. Now again, that came out of the exercise, and based on where that zoning or what the zoning would allow, hypothetically, you would come up with 2,711 units. On the commercial industrial side, we have also subcategories, with a total of almost 3 million square feet, broken out into general retail, dining and drinking establishments, community shopping center, neighborhood shopping center, so on and so forth. So that's what we started with, and I'm going to show you that we had to break this down even further, because in order to really get a more of an accurate understanding of the fiscal implications, we have to, for example, for residential units, we have to add in how many bedrooms, right? Because people really drive the model for service impacts. Depending on the number of people that come into a development, which is ultimately determined by the number of bedroom units for that, for each unit, they're going to determine the service costs. For commercial industrial square feet, we had to break this down a little bit as well, because within the broader categories of general retail or community shopping center, there are what we refer to as smaller types of commercial establishments, which I'll get to in a second. Here's the breakout that we created for housing, all right? As you can see on the left column, I get my pointer here. Again, here's the 2,711 units, and we have each of the categories broken out by their numbers. Now, we went further, again, in order to produce what we needed to out of the model. We have to make assumptions on number of bedrooms per category of housing. So what you see here going the right direction, studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, and then we're showing you the number of units or the number of bedroom counts for that particular category. So for example, in studios, which there are no studios in single family detached or in townhouse units, you would find those in low-rise and mid-rise multifamily rental units. We're showing you 87 studios for low-rise, 70 studios for mid-rise. This was done somewhat arbitrarily, but I've been doing this work for close to 30 years, and so I'm very familiar with bedroom breakouts for different categories of housing units. So I was able to use my experience in kind of coming up with these ratios of bedroom counts. And as you can see, I have this done for all of the bedroom counts and all of the categories of residential. Now, this is important to understand. Right now, just under 50% of the dwelling units that are being modeled here are 3 and 4 bedrooms. Why is that important? Is because 3 and 4 bedroom units are going to produce the most number of residents and certainly public school age kids. So it's important to note that a little bit, slightly more than 50% of these units will be 2 bedrooms or less, which typically feature fewer people and certainly fewer public school age children. So that when you see the multipliers in the projected number of total residents and public school age children, you'll have an understanding of why those numbers are what they are. Some people might say, well, they look low, but again, they are all a function of bedroom counts. And again, that's the 3-4 bedroom mix. As we did with residential, we broke out into subcategories for commercial. And principally, we did this with retail. We didn't have to touch office or flex warehouse space. But in retail, these categories are a little bit too broad for modeling purposes. So we made assumptions here, and for example, we've got the categories or subcategories of bank, pharmacy, fast food, full service restaurants, cafes, service retail, convenience retail, big box grocery. And we tried to, or we made assumptions on where the square footage or how the square footage would be broken up by these general categories. So I'm not going to go into this. You will have this as part of your workbook. But this is also very important for you to understand. And while we were not contracted to perform a market study, and we do a lot of market studies as part of our portfolio of work, I will tell you with a great deal of certainty that of the almost 2 million square feet of retail that is identified here as, saying, we could zone for this per the how should we grow exercise, you'll probably be lucky to see half of that, or a little more than half of that, actually materialize. And as some of you who may be familiar, retail is going through a major evolution, and the type of retail that we're talking about is general category or comparison retail, which would be the bulk of the kind of retail that you've got identified here, certainly under general retail, and a good portion in that community shopping center category. So while I've modeled it here, I think it is important for you to understand that it is highly unlikely, certainly within the next 10 years, if not the next 15 or 20, that you would see much of that retail materialize. I'm more confident about the professional office space. Medical office is probably also high. I mean, almost 500,000 square feet of medical office is quite a lot, but it's possible. And certainly you could easily exceed the 500,000 square feet of flex warehouse. Matter of fact, there's probably developers salivating to build it right now. Now, quickly moving on, what are the total impacts identified based on that program that I just showed you? Well, based on those number of housing units that we identified, I believe it's 2,700, we came up with 5,224 residents, and I'm going to show you based on the multipliers that we used a bit shortly. 1,175 school children and approximately 8,000 employees, private sector employees that would work at these various business establishments. So this is what we, again, if this were to drop out of space today and land in South Whitehall Township, and based on all the variables that we have plugged into the model and assumptions made, this is what we would expect to see, okay? Pretty broad-based stuff. What are the associated revenue impacts with all of this? Well, for the township, we'd be looking at, and again, this is 1 year, and we consider this, or what we refer to as a stabilized year. Stabilized meaning that you're not renting, you're not in the process of renting out all the units or in the process of selling all the townhomes in a given, development tract. It's everybody's moved in, your, typical annual vacancy rate is already established. So this would assume that everything is stabilized. Year one, total property tax revenues for the township, 7.1 million. Local service tax revenues for the township, 171,000. Local EIT revenues, approximately 1.1 million. For the Parkland School District, property tax revenues, 33.8 million. And then for the school districts, the EIT revenues, approximately 2.1 million. That's, again, based on all the factors, current tax rates, and, we assumed everything is at market value, assessed at 100% as soon as it's built. And, these are the revenue figures that we've come up with. What are the service impacts? In this case, public employees. Now, this is subject to scrutiny by your police department, your DPW director, and certainly the superintendent of schools. But we had to plug in some numbers here. And again, kind of based on all the fiscal impact analyses that we do on behalf of communities like South Whitehall Township, we made what I consider educated guesses about how many new personnel would need to be put in place for these different major service categories. We're talking about 16 full-time police officers, 12 full-time DPW employees, and approximately 25 school employees, some of whom obviously would be teachers, some of whom would be paraprofessionals and other support staff. All of these numbers that I'm showing you could easily go up, all right? I doubt they would go down if they went down by much, but they could easily go up. So what we're saying is I'd like to have the heads of these different departments and or districts take a look at these figures and help to revise them. The challenging part about this is obviously a lot of this is hypothetical, and we're also talking about something that would happen far out in time. So this is why we have these caveats about you can't really put a lot of weight on something like this, which really won't be known until sometime in the future. Service costs, total impacts identified based on what we know about your current budget, how that budget is allocated for paying for services, and also the types of land uses that you have in your community, residential versus commercial, industrial. We were able to identify that on an annual service cost basis, you would have about $3.1 million associated with the township service costs, $5.7 million associated with the service costs for the school district. When you receive the fuller workbook, it'll give you a better explanation about how we arrive at some of this stuff. Finally, population multiplier tables, as I mentioned. Forward planning, we typically had relied upon, as most consultants have, on the residential multipliers that have been produced by Rutgers University, which I'm proud to say I'm an alum, and were first produced back in the 1990s and then updated again, actually most recently in 2018. However, those multipliers are still, they are based on 2000 census data, so they're still very much out of date. So what we did, because we were in process of creating an online fiscal impact application that's going to be commercially available, is we contracted a data scientist and we produced our own residential multipliers as well as public school age multipliers. We did this for every state, as a matter of fact. And long story short, and we have an explanation of this in our fuller workbook, we were able to look at US Census data, more specifically American Community Survey data, which is produced annually. And we ran sophisticated regression analysis on how many people live in what type of housing unit, and more specifically, people that have moved into that housing unit within the last 4 years, so that we try to make this as relevant as possible to having new housing built and to identify or understand who moves into that type of housing when it's built. And so based on that, based on doing the regression analysis, and this is specific to Pennsylvania, we were able to identify the multipliers that you see in this table. And the way that you're going to use this, and I've got the examples on the far right, is, for example, if we were to look at a 3-bedroom townhouse unit, okay, and that would be single family attached, and you wanted to know if there were going to be 100 3-bedroom townhouse units, how many total people would result or be anticipated, it would be taking the multiplier, in this case 2.67 under the single family attached and associated with the 3-bedroom, and you multiply that by the number of units, 100, and obviously you would get 267 persons or residents would be anticipated. You would do the same thing if you want to understand how many public school age children would result. You'd go to that column for single family attached, you look across 3-bedroom, it's 0.49, 100 3-bedroom townhouse units is anticipated to generate 49 public school age children. Now, for those who might scoff at the numbers, particularly for public school age children, please understand that fertility rates in this country have been in decline for well over 20 years. And as a matter of fact, the latest CDC report identifies as we having the lowest fertility rate, and we're below the replacement rate, and that hasn't been seen since, I believe, the 1950s. So when we talk about these types of multipliers, they are reflective of today's reality and not as many kids being produced. So there's that. And I know we're going to hold questions to the end, but that is my 15 minutes, I believe. I will stop sharing.
I think the one of the things that Todd mentioned that I probably should have mentioned is the scenario that we are talking about is a hypothetical, just kind of based on the where and the how. Hypothetically, this is what we potentially be looking at, and the intention is to use this information as a guide moving forward for the recommendations in the working groups. With that, I will make Scott, find Scott in the list. It's alphabetical. I should find you. Scott, you should have presenter role.
Okay. Thank you. Does everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
And can you see my cursor moving on the screen?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Good to be with everyone this evening. I'm Scott Pasterski with Keystone Consulting Engineers. And just by way of introduction, similar to the economic impacts that Todd has gone into a bit here, with new development and planned development comes obviously impacts to the traffic network as well. So that would be my portion of the model, and to bring hopefully some ideas, some things to think about to the table. Hopefully show you a few areas where the modeling has indicated some areas where some attention needs to be considered as planning efforts move forward. So really the purpose of my exercise is just to inform the future planning efforts as you go through in future workshops, give you some results based on analysis, which I will show you shortly, and also provide some suggestions, some ideas. While this was not a formal traffic impact study, prepared to those types of rigors, that would, during such a study like that, we would normally identify specific improvements, so this much turn lanes and signal timing improvements. We didn't go to that extent, but I would like to provide you with some tools that you can consider as you go to plan, some food for thought, maybe some things you hadn't thought of before that could be helpful. So I'm going to jump into the first slide here, and I'm seeing this. Okay, okay, everyone still sees the screen. I had a pop-up here. I'm not sure what that was all about. But the first, let me get back to my first slide. There we go. So you should see an image on the screen, and the image, it's kind of a busy slide, a little busier than I would like it to have been. However, this is basically South Whitehall Township is what you're looking at. The hexes shown in the background, those mirror what was previously identified in the other phases of the planning efforts. And the orange lines here that I'm pointing out, this is 476 to the far east. This is Route 22 running east and west right across the middle of the township. We have I-78 to the bottom corner of the township. And we didn't study those roads, but I just wanted to provide those just for a background and framework. The purplish roads that are indicated here specifically, that would be Cedar Crest Boulevard running north and south, Tillman Street, Route 309, of course, Walbert Avenue, Huckleberry. These are the roads, or Hamilton Boulevard, if I didn't mention that. These are the roads that we paid particular attention to because they were located either proximate to the urban or the development areas identified in the workshop meetings, or maybe the development itself wasn't proximate to it. However, we anticipated traffic from the development to head toward these roadways. And the yellow dots, if you haven't figured out already, those are study intersections that we focused on. So an example of what I'm saying is if this is a greenfield development in the upper right corner, certainly that roadway is included, but also that traffic is headed more than likely to the retail and offices down here on Cedar Crest and the Route 22 interchange, and also to get on the highways to exit the township as they would need to. So that's the focus of our study. In order to complete that study, again, this is another overwhelming slide. Please ignore all the detail, other than to note that all of these boxes with numbers on them were areas that, based on some good information provided by the township staff, were areas where development from the various, either urban infill, greenfield, or redevelopment development types would enter into the traffic network. So where my analysis picks up is where, XYZ greenfield development up here in the right corner, traffic enters onto Cedar Crest Boulevard, and then I take it from there. So this just to show, again, I'm not showing you a third of all the information that went into the study, but this is just a summary. This was information obtained from the township. So what we really want to look at here, everyone wants to kind of see the results, and I'll get to those very shortly. But we basically looked at two snapshots in the future. This was a planning effort, a planning study. So we looked at a relatively long time period in the future. That would be a 20-year projection. So approximately the year 2040 is what we considered for this exercise. We looked at two snapshots of potential. The first would be a base traffic condition, which was, you can think of it this way, it would be basically if no further development happened in the township, and the only thing that happened was the current traffic volumes on the roadways would grow in accordance with the typical growth rate, like an annual growth rate, just like a bank account would grow annually, a certain percent per year. That plus traffic from developments that are approved already, however, have not been built yet, so therefore are not reflected in any traffic count information that we used as the basis of the study. So that's an unrealistic scenario because development will occur. However, we established that at the year 2040 to act as a baseline. That gives us a baseline to compare our future development traffic with the development scenarios included to have a relative impact. So I'm going to not go too much into the weeds here with all the studies, but we did obtain traffic counts from the traffic impact studies that were submitted to the township. That covered most of the study intersections, but there were some gaps, so we actually performed additional counts, hired an outside firm, and filled in the gaps. Of course, we had to adjust for COVID because, like everything, COVID brought the traffic volumes down, and it wasn't a normal year, if you will, but that was adjusted for. And all the traffic was projected up to the year 2040 for the base condition. And so without further ado, let me just jump right to the 2040 base condition results. Now, I have to have a disclaimer here for a second. Those of you that are somewhat accustomed to hearing traffic presentations, or you've seen traffic impact studies before, or perhaps you've prepared them, normally they're graded on a level of service grade criteria, where level of service A is basically no congestion, traffic is flowing freely, whereas level of service F is failing levels of service, where traffic is not flowing freely. You're waiting multiple cycles perhaps to get through a traffic light. And like a report card, A is good, and F is really bad. Well, the first thing you're going to notice here, you see some letters greater than F in there. You see G's and you see some H's. And that's because the model that we used for this planning application was not the typical model that would normally be used as part of a normal, I hate to say normal, but a more specific traffic impact study. So actually the worst case in this model, which is called the ICU method, or intersection capacity utilization method, is a level of service H. So just keep that in mind. F is not as bad as it gets. It gets a little worse with H. And this method was chosen because it was available, and it requires, again, for a planning study, the inputs required didn't require the details that would be normally required for a full-blown traffic impact study. So anyway, the results. So looking at the map, you can see, and again, this is the 2040 base traffic conditions, no development. We've got some level service Fs, some Gs, 1H here along the Cedar Crest corridor. Really there's some qualitative, I don't expect you to be able to read this. I can zoom in a little bit, but there's qualitative descriptors to each level of service category. Let me just zoom in there for a second. Level service A, I won't go through all these, but it's less than 55% of the intersection's capacity is utilized. So 45%, you can add 45% more traffic and be, under capacity, all the way to level service H, which is well over capacity. So this is the intersection that's congested. People aren't getting through the light. They're frustrated. This is what everybody thinks about when they think of gridlock, and everything in between. And there's, there are quantitative measures here, and I'm not going to focus on those right now, but suffice it to say that the Cedar Crest corridor is already, oops, skipped ahead, sorry. The Cedar Crest corridor is already approaching capacity or over capacity in some situations at various intersections. Tillman Street, Hamilton Boulevard, not doing as bad, but there's a critical intersection here at the I-78 eastbound ramps with Hamilton Boulevard that's not doing well. It's more spotty. Tillman Street is, again, none of this looks really good, but it's, again, and I have to piggyback off what Todd said, was that, this is assuming all of this development happens, which, all at once, it just somehow drops in. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at these kind of drastic looking results. And, you do see some Bs. I don't think there's a single A that was reported here, but,
Scott,
so just,
hi,
yes.
Scott, just real quick, when you're looking at the base condition and you talk about approved development, did you consider the improvements that are associated with the approved development?
Yes, good point. We obtained traffic studies from the development. So we had, if they put in a turn lane or any improvements like that, we did include that.
Okay.
As part of the approved developments. Yes, thanks for the clarification. Also, the traffic lines associated with that.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, this is Dave Wilson on the Planning Commission. And if I'm jumping the gun, just let me know and we can address it later.
Yeah, Dave, I don't know if you were in at the beginning. I saw you joined a little late. We were trying to save questions for the end.
Okay.
So if it can wait, that's great.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry about that.
Keep it going now. That's fine too. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to jump right over to the 2040 future development conditions. Again, it's assuming that everything is developed all at once, and you can see some things pop out immediately. We have what you might call a hotspot on Cedar Crest Boulevard, where everything basically blows up. And so let me, before you, I know I kind of let the cat out of the bag by showing you these numbers first, but let me talk a little bit about what went into the future traffic conditions model. So basically our procedure was, based on the information provided by the township, the driveway locations, we performed a trip generation analysis based on the ITE manual, which is an industry accepted standard to estimate trips. Basically just using representative land uses for the uses identified. We considered shared or internal trips within, say a multi-use site. If there's retail and residential, there's a certain portion of those trips that will be shared. That was included in the model. Also, since this network is township wide, we also consider to some extent the effect of some internalization of trips or some shared trips within the network or within the township. In other words, someone might leave a retail facility here and drive to a home here and vice versa, but they didn't result in trips going all the way, outside of the network or outside of the township boundaries. So that was also anticipated in the model. We accounted for things like pass-by trips, which is, say, a classic example is if you have a shopping center where you have a certain portion of the traffic generated by that shopping center is already there on the roadway. So it's basically the drive-by, hey, I'm going home from work and I want to stop in and pick up this item and get right back on the road and continue on my way. That was included, which served to reduce the amount of trips modeled. And then the remainder of the trips were external trips, so trips that would leave a particular driveway or facility, and and were distributed based on proportional traffic volumes on the major roadways to the extents of the township. So I didn't expect you to follow all that, but if anybody has any questions, I can certainly follow up later with any details you would like to hear about. But that's some of the things that went into the model. And again, back to the results. When you add that, particularly on Hamilton Boulevard and Cedar Crest Boulevard, based on this, theoretical condition and, the assumptions that went into the planning model, things are really looking congested there. So what does that mean? And I'll get to the final portion of my presentation is, mitigation strategies as planning efforts consider. Again, I'm not saying here, I don't want to set the expectation that, Cedar Crest Boulevard is definitely going to do this, because again, the inputs to the model were theoretical. But just to, where is the model most sensitive? That would be a valid question to ask. The model is most sensitive where these hotspots are identified, and any planning effort should really focus on those areas. And just to reiterate, that would be Cedar Crest Boulevard, Hamilton Boulevard, to a lesser extent on Tillman Street, and some spot intersections on Walbert. And there might be a few more that I neglected to mention. So the final part of the presentation, everybody can pick their jaw up after seeing all these results like this. What are some mitigation strategies that could be considered? So as I mentioned before, these are just mentioned as suggestions, food for thought. And I'd be happy to follow up and have as many conversations as needed with anybody that wants to learn more about some of these things. I mean, the most plain vanilla, straightforward thing you can do when you have too much traffic is you can do structural improvements that would look like roadway improvements, widening, adding turn lanes, maybe adding through lanes, things of that nature. It could look like interchanges needing to be reconfigured on a very large scale if things are really difficult. It could look like signal timing improvements, which is a much more modest improvement, and a lot can be done with signal timing improvements. So that's kind of the more straightforward, conventional ways of planning for these developments as development would move forward, to keep that in mind in planning efforts. But there's some other things to keep in mind that maybe you hadn't thought of. One would be, basically enhancing multimodal choices of the traveling public. So the study that was prepared numerically did not consider reductions for multimodal, such as bus routes and things like that. However, it's generally acknowledged that these are going to serve to reduce trips as people serve alternate mode choices. Things like also enhancement of sidewalks, bike paths, things like that, to get people to walk to work or walk to the store. Those are things that also could be considered. Also, in land development planning, planning things like shared use developments, where you have perhaps a strip of commercial and apartments on top, or something like that, where it doesn't generate an external trip. People can either use internal driveways to access needed retail facilities, or they can walk, or things that can be considered. And lastly, and I know I'm rattling these off quickly, but lastly, another thing that could be considered and perhaps has not been considered so far is travel demand management. And what that means is basically, instead of trying to change the road network, change the pedestrian network, change public transportation to accommodate more drivers, it's the other end of the other side of the coin, which says, how can we change driver behavior so that it's more friendly to the road network? So it's flip-flopped, if you will. So that would include things like incentives for ride sharing, perhaps coordination with local business owners, industries, industrial uses, on shift times, wherever the big pumps and pulses of traffic come into the network, trying to coordinate, and there are negative ones as well. I think those are probably, less popular, but there's enforcement and things like that. Penalties for doing things that aren't good for the network, and not making a value judgment on whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's an option on the table. So those are, 4 different ways I think I listed, 4 different categories of ways to keep in mind during future planning. And hopefully some of that was triggered something you hadn't perhaps thought of before. And on this last slide, you'll see I have my contact information. You want to screenshot that or just contact Keystone Consulting Engineers. My email's there, my phone number. If anybody has any questions, I'd be completely more than happy to have a further discussion. So that's all I had. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, Scott. I think I know what H stands for. It stands for help. Just, I know we're trying to save questions. I'm just wondering how, just perhaps while the slide's up, the H's along Cedar Crest that are around 22, if, for example, if that interchange was improved, would that kind of back up and help relieve some of the additional H's? Again,
actually,
right now.
Yeah, just very hypothetical. Actually, here's something that that happens sometimes where we saw it on Route 22 recently, where one intersection was improved, and what happened is the problem just moved downstream. So sometimes the congested intersections actually serve to help downstream conditions. So if an improvement was done, say on the Route 22 interchange, that opened up capacity, that would actually open the floodgates, if you will, and could actually worsen conditions downstream. So it's very much a ripple effect. So once the floodgates are open, it's kind of, you have to chase it until it's no longer an impact.
Okay, so in that scenario, the impacts downstream would be onto 22 because you're opening the floodgate onto 22 in essence. And I don't want to go into too much detail right now because I want to kind of stay on track, but thank you. We will, the other kind of clarifying thing for this is this is hypothetical and just used as a guide for things to consider, potential problem areas as we get into our working groups. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Hannah Clark, who's going to go over kind of the working group, how that's going to roll out. And why don't I see Hannah?
Right here.
Here's the list. I was looking under.
I can't share my.
You're under the C's.
Mm.
There we go.
All right. Well, I will jump in. I know there are lots of questions, and we definitely want to have a robust discussion. So what I am going to discuss now, as Dave shared, is really our approach. How do we take this modeling work that you've heard from Todd and Scott, and then also layering in existing conditions and all the other pieces of the comprehensive planning effort, and move these into the working group session. So what is on my screen right now, or what is on your screen right now, is the proposed timeline for the Phase 4 Comprehensive Plan Working Groups. And before I jump into just briefly talking about the flow of the meetings, I want to emphasize that everyone here tonight, you may have signed up already to be part of a working group, or you may have seen this on the public notice or heard about it in another way. Moving forward, we really encourage everyone to sign up for the working groups. I'll have that link in a few slides, because that's how we will be communicating the scheduling of these meetings, as well as sharing what has been referenced a few times, which is called the workbook, which is basically the guide to going through all these meetings. So we'll make sure that link is shared. You'll see it here, and I'll also share it in the chat. So you can go and sign up if you have not done so already. So as you can see, tonight's the introductory virtual meeting, and then we're going to move into the by topic working group meetings. So again, if you've signed up or you've seen, we have 5 working groups by topic: transportation, housing, resource protection, community facilities, and community utilities. And so these 5 groups will meet by topic. And the first working group meeting will look at existing conditions. So what does the 2009 comprehensive plan say? That's what's being updated for all the work that you're going to put in and doing the recommendations. How do we take into account what's been shared by Todd and Scott and by Dave and the where and how do we grow? So that will be scheduled for the week of July 12th. And how that will get scheduled is, again, we're going to reach out by working group topic. So sign up and make sure we have your email on the form. And then we will send along a scheduling form to identify the best time and day for that working group the week of July 12th. Our second working group meeting is going to be in collaboration with the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, and they are serving as what we're calling our subject matter experts for this process. And they will help facilitate with each working group topic a brainstorm to start to begin to identify recommendations. So they're there as a resource. They're there to give some insight as to how the regional planning fits into this local municipal planning, and will really be a conversation and a discussion and an opportunity to begin identifying some solutions similar to what Scott was doing as he talked about some of the mitigation measures. So as you can see, those have already been scheduled. And again, this all will be shared again, but we did have to, because of scheduling with Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, we did have to schedule some sessions concurrently. So I also should mention that I know in the sign up, some folks have signed up to be in multiple groups. All group meetings will be recorded. We are providing an option of in-person or virtual for meetings 1 and meeting 3 of the working groups. And so if we do it in person, we'll stream the meeting and record it, so that's available. But the second meeting with LVPC will all be virtual. And again, every meeting will be recorded. And particularly when we have 2 meetings happening at the same time, you can go back and watch the recorded meeting. So the third working group meeting is where the rubber hits the road. We'll be developing the recommendations using a template that will really get to what are the goals, what are the actions, where is the funding, what's the timeline, who is leading it, and who are the stakeholders, what is the implementation timeline. So all these different pieces will begin to build out and prepare for that concluding working group meeting the week of August 9th, where we will present out to all the working group members. Will meet together and recommendations will be presented out to all working group members and the Planning Commission. And I just want to say, we know this is an accelerated schedule and we know this is a lot to commit to, and we really, really appreciate your interest and commitment, and we will facilitate and make it as easy as we can to participate. Even if you have to miss a meeting, we'll have recordings. These workbooks will be distributed by the end of the week, so you'll be able to see how the process builds on one another. So again, and taking you through, so as you can see today, we're at the working group intro meeting. Again, these are actually all taken from the workbook. So you'll see these as the introducing framing for every session you're going to go into. So again, the existing conditions, these are the goals. The outcome will be a baseline understanding of where we are today. And a lot of what you've heard today will also be incorporated into that discussion. Then again, with Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, how do we take best practices and apply them here? What considerations are to be made? And again, thinking about the models and scenarios that you've heard about earlier from Todd and Dave and Scott. Finally, the recommendations, prioritizing and developing them will be the third meeting. And then finally, the concluding meeting will be the opportunity to take everything that's been done in the workbook and synthesize it and pass off a master workbook to the Planning Commission. So again, this process is really collaborative, it's iterative, and it's a really important opportunity to come together and share and build the vision for the comprehensive plan update. So again, these are the next steps. As I've said, the link that if you have not signed up for a working group and you do want to continue on and be part of these working groups, please go to this link. Again, I'll put it in the chat, and make sure to sign up. You don't have a limit on how many working groups you can participate in, but you did see it's a pretty intense schedule, so you might have to put aside a lot of time. But you can always access the recordings and engage in that way as well. So tomorrow, everyone who has signed up for a working group will receive a scheduling email. If you don't get to sign up till later in the day, we'll make sure you get it before Friday. The second, which is when we're going to be sending out the workbooks. The workbooks are going to be both in digital format, and these are to, again, accompany you through the working group process to give you the information you need and also provide a framework for having discussion and making recommendations. So those will go out on this Friday. The second will also launch on the South Whitehall Township website, web pages for each working group, which will be the resources where the workbook lives, where the recordings are, and any supplemental information. Additionally, you can pick up hard copies of the workbook, I believe, starting on Tuesday, July 6th at the South Whitehall Township Municipal Building. And again, this is a summary here as we go through the timing of the working group. Again, it is accelerated, but it's meant so that really you can take what you have done and build and apply it. So it's staying fresh and it's moving forward. Again, here are contact information. Dave and Greg are obviously the municipal leadership, and myself and my colleague Chris Urbasco will be serving as the meeting facilitators. So again, some of you may have gotten an email already from me letting you know about tonight's meeting, and establishing myself as the point of contact as we move forward with the working group. So with that, I will stop, and I know I think we're going to head into questions very soon. So I can provide any more information, and again, I'll drop that sign up link into the chat. Thank you so much.
All right, so I think the best way to proceed is we have some BOC membership here and Planning Commission, so let's kind of open it up to them first, and then we'll open it up to residents. So BOC or Planning Commission would like to ask any questions or comments?
Yeah, David.
Yeah.
This is Commissioner Wall. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wrote down several questions during each presentation. Would it be all right if I went through all of them? They're not long. I think the answers are short.
Sure.
So I'll do it in the order the presentation occurred. Is this presentation online? I think Hannah just said it is.
It will be, yes.
Will be, okay. All right. And your presentation slides on how we will build, there were some percentages listed, and if you explain what the percentages mean, I missed it.
So
Could you tell us?
Yeah, the percentages are the percent that encouraged. So if you remember, the visual preference survey had 3 options: encourage, I think it was indifferent, and then discourage. So we looked at the encourage percentages and chose the percentages, the highest encouraged percentage for each of the scenario combinations. And then, so there's a document that we're finalizing that will have all of that information and the breakdown of each of the selections.
And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but some people must have encouraged more than one method, because like some slides you presented 3 items and they had like 50, 51, 51%. Which adds up to more than 100%. So.
That was for that individual slide. So that was the individual picture response. So it was 51% of people on that picture encouraged it. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay, question for Todd Poole. Todd, thank you for your excellent work. Presentation was very informative. My question is it's sort of more general. Could you comment on the relationship between the commercial and residential build out and exclude the pandemic? I mean, just in general, people provided their input. You looked at the input, and is this a realistic ratio for the way things are typically built out? I know you made the one comment that people may have overstated the commercial build out and it'll be less, you know, due to the pandemic and as more people work at home. But could you just say, is it realistic, and did you put your expertise into making it realistic?
Well, I'll answer that last question first. I took the numbers that were given to me in terms of the build out numbers. So I didn't change anything. I didn't reduce, for example, the number or the amount of retail square footage or restaurant square footage. I just took what was provided and modeled it. Now, my expertise and experience says that there's way too much restaurant space, there's way too much retail space, and that realistically, you're going to get some fraction of that actually developed. And you should know this too, is that, and this is an overused term so far over the last 14 months, but the pandemic accelerated what was already happening specifically for retail and also generally for office. And that is, there's this evolution that was happening in retail, having a lot to do with technology and with change in consumer preferences, right? I mean, the type of retail that we, most on this call, have known since we were small is, you know, malls and big shopping centers and that kind of thing. And that was driven principally by the baby boom generation, which historically has been the wealthiest generation to really have the planet of the earth, and has had a great deal of discretionary income, which made the development of that kind of retail possible. We are now in a different realm for a variety of reasons, not least of which because of preferences of people purchasing experiences over things, younger generations not as interested in acquiring things and goods as we were, and also technology for those who do want to buy things, you know, Amazon being chief among those. Like, we're getting our retail goods from online stores that are delivering it. So when you add all those things up, the amount of physical store space, while it will not go away, will be certainly much scaled back than you know what we are used to. So that's number one. And I would say that in terms of how it builds out, retail follows rooftops. Okay, so the way that this build out would occur is you would need a certain number of housing units, and then a certain amount of retail would come in. Then you'd build a certain amount more of housing units, and a certain amount of retail and restaurants would come in. That's typically how it works. I note that before I even got on the call, I looked at how much regional retail you have, which is, you know, on the order of 2 million square feet at least. And, you know, to suggest adding almost double that, that's just not going to fly. So.
Okay, thank you. That was a very thorough answer. So as you know, we've long awaited the results of your analysis, and we appreciate it very much. I have a couple questions for Scott. Likewise, thank you for your excellent evaluation which you presented. Easy question. Did you consider the impact of the surrounding areas? You know, most notably things going on in North Whitehall Township, like warehousing up there.
Well, it was considered not in the not specifically, you know, not specifically on a development by development basis, but the kind of the catch-all for that, you know, being that this was a planning study, was the background growth rate. So that the intent of that background growth rate is to account for the accumulation of traffic from developments and, you know, growth outside the area. And so it wasn't considered, but not on a specific by development basis.
All right, thank you. This question, I may have missed it, you may have said it. What actually does H mean? Does H have some type of quantification?
It does.
It means help.
That's a great question.
I know, besides help.
Yeah, the quantification there is basically saying that the intersection is over capacity by greater than greater than 9%. So it's 109% or greater overloaded is basically what that means quantitatively. So that,
Right.
to put it another word, in qualitative terms, that would be anticipating. Again, this is all based on the theoretical. So I don't want to harp and be a prognosticator and say this is what's going to happen. I'm just saying that LOS qualification or that LOS designation would indicate prolonged periods of congestion and queuing for probably 60 to 120 minutes in the peak hours. If it ever happened, if it's all in the input into the system is what we turn the crank and what was spit out.
All right, thank you. One question for Hannah. I saw the meeting sequence. Regarding the working group meetings, which are the subject matter, I couldn't tell from your information whether those will be on separate nights or whether they will be like parallel meetings on the same night.
So that will be determined by the scheduling form that we're going to be sending out tomorrow morning. So if you signed up for multiple working groups, you would let us know. There's an opportunity in the scheduling form to indicate optimum days, optimum times per topic area. Then you can also make sure to let us know if you are serving in multiple groups, so we can try our best to not schedule concurrent sessions by topic for meetings 1 and 3. For meeting number 2, where we are with Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, those are set in stone because of their schedule, and we will make sure the recordings are available to everybody if you do have to choose between one of the topics. Did that answer your question, Mr. Wolk?
Yes, I think yes, and it'll become more apparent when we see the scheduling form.
Yes, and that will go out first thing tomorrow for all who have signed up.
And my last point is a comment and not a question for the BOC and for David and your entire support team. As you know, we've had a lot of discussions in the township between the BOC and the staff and with the public on board about whether meetings will be in person or will be virtual, and how we will provide the opportunity for everyone or most people in the public to attend. I simply want to note that I'm not aware of any discussion we had with the BOC on board as to whether these meetings would be in person or virtual. That's just a basic comment. No need to reply to that at this time. Perhaps a follow-up discussion on this subject might be worthwhile. Thank you.
Tori had her hand up, and then Dave Wilson also had a question. So either one, ready.
I think I got my question answered. I just have a quick comment. I just want to commend the entire team for the work done to date. I think it's amazing, and this is a this is a crossroads time, I think, too, with looking at the different types of business and development and dynamics as a result of COVID, and also the changing in the demographics and the future of what different age groups and generations are going to be looking for in a community. So finding that balance and finding that mix is no easy task. And I've seen a little bit of almost all of it in your discussions today, and I commend you for always looking at every single piece of it. And thank you. So looking forward to the to the groups, the working groups, and more information. Great job so far.
Yeah, and I think that the idea behind these presentations is to provide as much information as we can moving forward for decision making and recommendations. So encompassing as much information as we can provide to the public. Planning Commission and BOC is what we're trying to do. David, thank you for waiting patiently. You're up.
Yes, and I'm not sure if I'm jumping the gun, so if there aren't answers to the questions now, maybe it's food for thought as we get further along in this comp plan process. But I was looking at the traffic study, and there's a lot of concern about traffic. We know a lot of those roads like Cedar Crest, Hamilton and whatnot already get pretty congested. So my question is, we have that data. How do we put that into action to enable the township to enforce some road improvements by the developers? And I know the issue with with us and pretty much every municipality in terms of municipalities planning code, you can really only require the developer to improve the portion of street along their property frontage. But with this comp plan data, this traffic study data, which shows significant impacts to traffic, can we earmark those areas in the comp plan to say, hey, these roads should be earmarked to get more right of way, and then since it's in the comp plan, does that enable us to have the developer who's developing the property and as a result increasing the traffic, does that enable the township to say, hey, it's in the comp plan, you need to address the comp plan and make these off-site road improvements?
So I guess the short answer is, those are definitely discussions that hopefully will occur, and I suspect they will occur in the working groups where they make the recommendation for inclusion in the comp plan to do exactly that, figure out ways that we can ask developers to make improvements if it's identified in the tools that are available for us to use. For example, the official map. If things are shown on an official map, there's certain things that discussions and negotiations that open up because we've implemented that planning tool. So that's kind of a shortish answer. But again, that kind of gets into the working groups specific topic areas.
Yeah, because my concern is, we have this good data, and I know Scott put a lot of effort into it, and they've been doing it a long time, and it's very good data. But if we don't use that data, if we just put it on a shelf and it doesn't enable us to enforce the developers to do off-site improvements, I don't know if the township has the funds to make all those road improvements and whatnot. So it's just some food for thought.
Yeah,
further down.
A general comment with comp plans and kind of my perspective on a comp plan is we develop as many tools as we can for use in the future. The travel model or the traffic model that Scott's worked on and the fiscal impact model that Todd's worked on can potentially be tools that we use in evaluating development in the future. And how that gets implemented into the comp plan zoning, official map, whatever tools we have available to us, kind of is what has to be worked out through the recommendations of the working group, and ultimately Planning Commission and the final comp plan, and then on to the BOC for formal adoption. So it's kind of all pieces to that puzzle. And like you said, getting as much data and good data as we can to make informed decisions is really what is behind all of this.
If I could just make a brief comment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to over talk anybody. Just a brief observation. Where the congested areas are shown on the future conditions model, I believe they're all of them on state highways. So any developments coming in, that would require access to the state highway or modification of an existing access to the state highway would have to go through PennDOT. And PennDOT, although it's not totally flawless or bulletproof, if you will, PennDOT can enforce offsite improvements to mitigate any traffic impacts. Again, maybe not to the extent that would be desired, but there is that mechanism in play as well.
Thanks, Scott.
And Diane Kelly has a question.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you all for your presentation tonight, for all of your work. It's very informative, very helpful for us. I just had a question on the service costs to the township. I noticed that on that chart, no new vehicles or buildings were included in the estimates to the township service costs. Is that something that can be estimated even if it's on a lower scale, so that we can maybe have a fuller picture of the anticipated costs to the township?
Yes, and I purposely left that out. Again, that's one of the more challenging ones to estimate, although, let's put it this way, I think it's a safe bet that if you had another 5,000 people come into a township of 20,000 people, you would most certainly have some serious capital improvements, investments to make. You'd probably need to expand your police department. You'd probably need to add another firehouse. You would most certainly add on to a couple of the school buildings. I doubt you need to build a new school, but you would need to probably add on. And perhaps even expand on your public works, garage and the like. So yes, we can offer some broad-based guidance on what those costs would be based on today's numbers. And I mean, that's the thing too to think about, is when we're producing all this in this model today, the way to think about it is everything would hold constant. The relationships between service costs and revenues, tax rates. If you jumped out into the future 5 years or 10 years, we make an assumption that the relationships and the ratios hold 5 or 10 years out. So even though we know everything will cost more, your revenues are going to be up too, because tax rates will most certainly reflect that. So what we produce for you today really is just, again, it's kind of an order of magnitude showing you, in relationship to everything else, this is what it would be.
Excellent. And is that something that we will discuss in the working groups, or is that something that you will present to us at the conclusion of all of this?
I mean, I can try and get you something in advance of the working groups. Again, it's based on, some broad-based, estimates, and you can have that to work with. I think what I'll produce is, if you had to build a new facility, it would cost X. So if you needed to build 2, just double it.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I have a comment on that subject, which we discussed at a previous meeting. So for I guess mainly Todd, and just to acknowledge this, and I don't want to deep drill it. We had a previous discussion about available studies that indicate the for the type of development, residential, commercial, industrial, and then preserved land, what the different costs are to the township for the given revenue. I think you acknowledged previously, Todd, that in a case like we have, where we're at a breaking point, or past the breaking point of needing, new facilities and, maybe even a new school, that these studies would apply when you do this type of work.
Yes, I didn't follow the question now. Sorry.
There was no question, just to acknowledge that
Yes.
these studies exist, and that's the type of information that would be used when you do your work and report back to us.
Yeah, and there's some rules of thumb to understand, is that probably the least service cost associated with development goes to light industrial, warehouse, flex, followed by certain types of commercial office uses, followed by retail, followed by housing. Now, housing, I have to be careful, because some people tend to think that all housing produces negative impacts. In other words, they don't pay for or cover the cost of services they receive, which is not true. There are certain types of housing units, and I would say these are single family 3 and 4 bedroom units, that are probably the biggest consumers of municipal services, and certainly school services. But when you think about multifamily residential, studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, those can be shown actually to pay their way, particularly if they were newly built and they're marketed towards a higher, socioeconomic household. So, there's gradations in there in terms of, who's paying their fair share kind of thing. But in general, you can make it a safe bet that housing will consume the greatest portion of your municipal and certainly your school services.
Yeah, thanks for that extra information. I wasn't aware of that, a consideration by housing type. So be interesting to learn more about that.
Sure.
Do we have any additional questions from BOC or Planning Commission?
Yeah, this is Bill McNair. The general questions. One, thank you for the presentations. They gave a lot of information. I'd like to know, for both the models, will we be able to see when is a workbook being developed, and can we see the assumptions that went in that both Todd and Scott talked about quite a bit? But is there an opportunity to run additional models, maybe varying some things if people have other ideas about what some of those inputs should be?
And so one of the things that, since we have these models, the baseline set up, definitely bringing Todd and Scott back in to evaluate at some point. I kind of envision bringing them back in at some point when the PC gets their hands on the comp plan, and through the workshops and kind of sifting through working group recommendations, bringing them back in to evaluate some of the recommendations that come through. Perhaps, it's Planning Commission workshop with Todd or with just Scott. And, we're focusing on transportation. We're focusing on fiscal impacts at specific meetings of the workshops, is kind of how I envisioned it rolling out. But again, once we get to the Planning Commission phase of the project, we can certainly have those discussions on how best to roll that out.
Okay, thank you.
Could I also add that since the models are constructed, we can run some tweaks if we need to. So that's something we can do. We have the potential to do that as well. So if we want to change certain aspects of the model, certain inputs, and rerun it, that's something that we've discussed and are capable of doing.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anybody else on the Planning Commission or BOC? I have a
I have a quick question for you.
Al,
And
yeah.
this relates to both Todd and Scott. As you know, we have several large projects in the planning process right now in the township. And I was kind of wondering how they factored into your at least initial conclusions, both economically and traffic-wise.
Scott, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, we, any improvements or any developments that were approved, we did include in the model from the traffic studies prepared. Most notably, the large residential development at Walbert and Cedar Crest. So, and I have a list here somewhere I could follow up with more detail, but we did make an effort to include any projects that were in the pipeline.
Okay, thank you. Todd?
My model actually did not incorporate the stuff that is in your pipeline right now. And for this reason, I think it needs to be modeled separately. Everything that's in your pipeline now has to be modeled for fiscal purposes separately to understand what those impacts are going to be, because that's going to in turn change some of the variables that I would then use to model what I've just done. If you can understand that, it's a significant enough development pipeline that it's going to change. It is going to change your budget. It's going to change likely your tax rates. So my preference is to do that separately, but then also needing to have a conversation with your business administrator and probably your CFO to talk about how that may change things like your current rateable base and tax rates and so forth, because then I would need to take those metrics and reapply them back to this model of all this hypothetical stuff. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense. But, I remember looking at the numbers you presented in terms of the 20-year out long-term growth. And I look at some of the growth that we're getting particularly from the one large project, and that eats up a large portion of your numbers. And I wonder if it's reasonable to recognize some impact from that in whatever our 20-year plan would be, or at least our 20-year horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. The short answer is yes, it would.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And again, thanks for doing such a good job for both you and Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go off the list of people that have put in questions and or ask a question. So first we have Charlie Schmale. Charlie?
Hi,
Yep.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Let's see, the question was written down. Question for Mr. Poole. If you do, I realize you do a lot of market studies. Could you talk a little bit about the housing affordability issues in South Whitehall in general in this type of community? I'm particularly concerned about young adult children of long-term residents being able to afford housing and how that impacts everything.
Yes, and while I should clarify, I did not do a market study for South Whitehall, so just put that out there. But given that I've done plenty of market studies throughout the Commonwealth and certainly kind of in your region, housing affordability continues to worsen. Even before the craziness of this current housing market, it was bad. It's just gotten worse because of it. And as a result, you're going to find that fewer young people are going to be able to purchase a home. As a matter of fact, I think there's going to be a lot of younger people I'm going to call, south of 35 years of age, or even 40 at this point, are going to find it very challenging to purchase a home, and more specifically a starter home. They're just not being built because the economics don't make it, don't make it attractive for developers to build. Developers would love to build housing that is affordable all day long because they know they've got a tremendous market, but the economics just don't work. And as a result, you're going to continue to see the development of either high-end multifamily or high-end single-family housing units. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing in particular for communities that want to draw in young working professionals or just young people generally, and really have that kind of cycle that is necessary to keep businesses in business. One way to help mitigate that, and it's, you're starting to see this around the country, is through zoning, which obviously zoning follows a comprehensive plan. And so zoning, being more permissive of accessory dwelling units, for example, or increasing density, or, kind of doing away with single family, zoning exclusively. These are all measures that you want to at least have a discussion about, because there are, there's just no one easy fix to get more housing that is affordable built. But there are some creative measures that are being taken now by communities all across the country that recognize if they don't start getting creative with their zoning laws, and also just working with developers to get more housing built, particularly at the lower end starter homes, that they will basically economically, you're going to face a challenging future, because housing and economic development are inextricably linked. If your housing policy is faulty or it's poor, eventually so too will be your economic development, environment. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Charlie, did you have another question?
I had a question for Mr. Petersky. I know Mr. Poole had questioned if there was so much demand for the amount of, for instance, big box commercial as was originally projected. If we assume that the township would move away from multiple new big box retail stores and instead emphasize well-distributed neighborhood commercial uses, mainly serving local residents, would that improve your traffic congestion projections?
I have to be pretty vague without looking into that. I mean, there's certainly the change of development types, certainly influences the numbers. Mixed use, as I said, will generally serve to reduce traffic numbers because of the shared trip, phenomenon, or the reality of shared trips. That particular scenario, I certainly could look at that, but I wouldn't want to fly off the seat of my pants here and give you an answer one way or another, because I could be wrong.
Any other questions, Charlie?
That's it for me. Thank you.
We have Bill F. I'm not going to try and pronounce your name. I apologize. Hello, Phil.
They just unmuted.
Let's see. Did he type a question in?
I don't believe so.
It's about Route 22.
There it is.
Okay, I see it. He asked, I'll just read the question. Scott, I realize that the traffic study focused on South Whitehall Township, but the heavy traffic on Route 22 directly impacts South Whitehall traffic. How do you plan for improvements in Route 22 when funding is uncertain?
I mean, that's a broader question. Certainly not the focus of the discussion. I mean, I know there's, and again, I don't want to speak out of turn. I know there's improvements being done to, as part of, I believe, the TIP and things like that. There's, recently parts of Route 22 were recently improved. I believe and maybe I should just be quiet because I'm not 100% sure of this, so I will be quiet. I won't comment further, but I would have to look into that further. I don't know if someone else might be more knowledgeable about the plans for future improvements to Route 22.
So just in general terms, the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission handles and distributes funding from the federal government for transportation. And they have what they call a long-range transportation plan, and then they also the TIP, which is a Transportation Improvement Program, which is used to distribute funding. So one of the things that happens is projects can be identified at the township level and then recommended to be included either on the LRTP, Long Range Transportation Plan, which would then eventually funnel to the TIP. And any coordination that we can do as a township with projects that are either on the LRT, Long Range Transportation Plan, or currently on the TIP, would certainly get a hold of some of that funding to help with spillover from like Route 22. So the comp plan, identifying areas or specific intersections or projects that get identified in the comp plan, official map can then get recommended to the LVPC for inclusion in those projects. So that just kind of talks about how we can use the comp plan to access funding from the federal level and coordinate with federally funded improvement.
David, can I add a point there?
Yep.
Shirley Schmale, the money that had been programmed to widen 22 in South Whitehall and other adjacent areas was diverted to build an interchange west of Fogelsville to allow more distribution centers out there.
Lovely. Okay. And next we have David Kennedy.
Thanks, David. My question is for Todd. I was very concerned about your fiscal impact study for Parkland School District. And 5,200 residents, 1,175 school children, et cetera, 25 employees. I just want to piggyback on what Al said. You didn't take into consideration the new Bridge Farms development. Did you talk with anybody at Parkland School District about your numbers?
About the projection of school children?
About any of your numbers concerning Parkland School District?
No, I haven't yet. I mean, I'm following up with both the municipal leadership as well as the school district. Again, I mean, here's what I would say is I don't know how practical or productive such meetings would be because it's such a hypothetical that would happen out over time and a long time. So, it would almost be alarmist to say, oh, by the way, you're going to get 1,300 more kids, and I don't know when they're going to come. Honestly, and let me say this, I do this a lot. I've talked to a lot of superintendents in my life, and I know how school districts work. I know, I know how they get their census data in terms of they look at births, rolling through the given county. I understand all of that. This is problematic because we're not talking about a specific development that is likely to happen in this defined period of time. We're talking about a huge hypothetical that would roll out, and I couldn't even say with any certainty, well, which housing units get built first, because the fact of the matter is, if most of those apartments got built first, which is probably likely, you would have a de minimis impact on the school system because most of those apartments would be studios 1s and 2s, which would produce very few school children. So it's a little challenging to really get them to say, well, this is what would happen, without being able to tell them timeframes?
Ridge Farms has been approved, and the Parkland School District is going to be going through planning for an addition to one of the schools for about 12 additional classrooms. That's in the work. We don't build one classroom at a time. We're going to build 10 to 12 classrooms. So the impact on South Whitehall Township residents, Parkland School District, is going to be a tremendous burden right there, just on those, the construction costs of that, adding new teachers, paraprofessionals, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that your numbers are, you may be doing it for a long time, but I've been doing it for 22 years on the school board, and your numbers are way off. We do our own studies, and we hire professional firms to look into that. So I just want to just comment that I think that, I know it's, you're saying it's hypothetical, but the reality is we're looking to expand Kratzer School by 10 to 12 shortly.
Right.
So it's not, that's not hypothetical, that's fact. So.
Right, but I'm not, I guess, I'm not saying, I guess we're talking on two different sides of a coin. You're going to be expanding the school system because you already know what's happening. I'm saying I can't tell you with any certainty how much of the housing that hypothetically was identified. And when I do these studies, I'm usually working on behalf of either the developer or the town because they know exactly what's going to happen in a near-term time period. This is not that case. And there's nobody that I know of professionally who could tell you what's going to happen without knowing a whole bunch of other variables. That's why I think it's more practical to think in terms of how this will roll out over time, near term, midterm, long term, because then we could start to get more precise about what the numbers would likely be. So for example, the fact that you're going to be building these new facilities and adding teachers, that's actually going to lessen the cost when new kids do show up, because this is the way it works, and I know this as a fact, is that most school districts in this country, and I mean most, have extra capacity, and that is as a case of a declining school-age child population. When a child shows up in a classroom and there's 5 empty desks, that kid doesn't cost $20 or $25 or $30,000. That kid costs maybe $3,000 to $5,000 at most. All right, and I know this because I've talked to superintendents who will tell me that. And that's when you've got capacity built in. So the fact that you're telling me you're going to be building new classrooms, and I've already looked at the census data for the Parkland School District, which projects out to 2040. By 2030, and based on the numbers I just looked at today, you're already going to be in decline before 2030, and that's based on birth rates, and that's in your report. That's in the report that was produced for Parkland. So I would say that with this build out, even hypothetically, and the fact that you're building classroom space, the impacts that you would realize from this project would not be as significant as you think, because the combination of you're already building classroom space and declining fertility rates, you're likely to see excess capacity 10 years out from now, which is maybe when you start to see this thing rolling in. So these are the kind of variables that I talk about that it's hard to wrap your head around, but I would be, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that you're going to be overrun with school kids at this moment.
So just to clarify, Ty, we just opened a new school last year because of overwhelming capacity called Veterans for Macungie, and a few years ago we opened Jandal. And I know you said the fertility rate is declining. I think everybody knows that. However, Parkland and South Whitehall Township are growing because of our quality of our school district and the quality of South Whitehall Township. So,
yeah, and if I jump in real quick, one of the things that this fiscal impact model, Todd kind of touched on it, and this brings up a really important piece of it, is the ability, it provides us the ability to model specific developments, and how we work that into the process and when that happens is something that we have to kind of figure out. But having the capabilities to plug in a Ridge Farm into the model, to me, is tremendously valuable, gives us insight. on what impacts could potentially come from any future development. So having this model available, I feel is very important and a great thing for us.
Thanks, David. I agree with what Greg said. You can plug in things because you can manipulate the model. So thank you.
Yep. We're getting close to the end here. We have Robert M.
Yes, hi, how are you? So, hi, Greg. So question for Todd. So has transiency been considered in the housing plan? In other words, the housing turnover, right? My perception of this area, and I'm not originally from here, but I've been here for quite a while, is that there's a lot of turnover in housing. So has that been considered in the plan?
I'm sorry, there's a lot of turnover in what?
Housing.
In housing?
Especially with the plan that you have of building townhomes, right? The townhomes have probably the highest turnover out of all the housing in the area. So I'm wondering if that's been considered.
Well, when you say turnover, because typically the highest turnover rate happens in rental units, and more specifically in multifamily. The lowest turnover rates are going to happen in single family and also I would say townhomes, particularly if they're owned. So if they're not rented and they're owned, you've got relatively low turnover rates in those kind of units. And more particularly what's happening demographically, and let's say this, one of the reasons that we have a housing crisis is because the ecology of housing has changed dramatically. Generally speaking, the way the housing market works, or at least the way it used to work, is you grow up, you go to college, or you leave your parents' home, and then you go rent something. And you rent something for 5 years, 7 years, and then you want to buy your starter home. Well, to buy your starter home, the person who owns a starter home needs to sell to move up into the move-up house. The person who's going to sell the move-up house or needs to move into downsized house, right? So it's this ecology. That ecology has been wrecked over the last 10 years for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the expense of building new housing. What we're seeing right now, and particularly right now in this moment in time, are more people are deciding to age in place, which is totally jamming up the entire system in front of it, right? So I would argue that you're not going to have as much turnover, at least insofar as the owner-occupied housing, the 3 and 4 bedroom single family detached, and even some of the townhouse stuff. But to your point, when housing does turn over, yes, people, somebody's going to move into that housing. No question about it. So, depending on who moves in, they start the cycle all over again. Maybe they have kids, but they probably don't have as many kids, if they have kids at all, as the family that once lived there. I think that's what you're going to start to see.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. And a question for Hannah. How can I find out how many people are already signed up to the various committees?
So the sign-up sheet doesn't keep track of everyone's information. We are keeping, contact information private, but I can just quickly tell you, I think we have about 14 or 15 people in housing, 10 people in community utilities, about, I think, 8 or 9 people in community facilities. Transportation is understandably one of the most popular, and that's around 15, 16 people, and resource protection is around 10 people.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
So I see Monica Hodges has a question for Todd. We're right up against 8 o'clock. If you can ask your question, hopefully we can answer it quickly.
Hi, thanks. I hope it's a quick one, and it's for Mr. Poole or whoever could answer. With all the dynamics and all the variables, is looking at a comp plan every 5 years rather than 10 years more sensible? Would that make more sense? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, you know what? I didn't mean to be flip or facetious, but yes, shorter periods of time in our world today, in my opinion, make more sense because think about it. What have we had in the last 15 years? A pandemic, the Great Recession, 9/11. I mean, there's so many things that we just can't predict, or what's referred to as black swan events, that the further out in time you try to plan, the greater the likelihood is that those plans are going to be wrecked by, events that just couldn't have been foreseen. So, and I understand too, that's not always practical to do it every 5 years, but maybe it's kind of a, kind of a look back to see, or check in every 5 years to say, does this plan still make sense given what we know in the world today?
And I could just kind of piggyback based on my experience in New Jersey. New Jersey has provisions in their municipal planning law that municipalities have to do a re-examination report. So that re-examination report looks at the comprehensive plan it used to be 10 years and then they dropped it to 6.
6.
Yeah. So I could see, making that sort of recommendation in this comp plan that, we re-examine it every, whatever we agree upon, every 3 years or something. And the purpose of that re-examination report is to identify potential areas that need to be addressed based on recent events. So it kind of forces municipalities to look at their comprehensive plan more than every 10 to 20 years.
Thank you so much.
Yep. So I think we're right at 8 o'clock. One of the things that I want to mention in closing is communication for the next 3 working group meetings will be made through the email list that we have through the signups. We will post when the meetings are, probably on the working group page once we get that set up. So if you're interested in any of those correspondences directly to the working groups, I would recommend signing up for them. Doesn't necessarily mean that you need to attend all of them, but if you just want to be informed of what's going on with each of the working groups, by all means sign up so that you are informed. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to the people that are watching this or have sat through this and watched this on video, the recording. Thank you, and thank you to Todd and Scott for all your hard work, and Hannah and Chris for setting up all the workbooks, and Rob for helping with all the graphics and the other document. Greg, and thank you, Greg, for being Greg. You're such a...
I was going to say, this is your last chance. If you know somebody out there who would be a good candidate to join a working group, we've got until Friday for a sign up. So please get out there, and the more people we can get involved in this, the better.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone. We will post a recording as soon as we can. We might have some technical issues, but we will certainly get it up as soon as we can. And again, if you have any questions for individually, feel free to contact myself or Greg, and we can channel the questions to whoever it needs to go to if we can't answer. So thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, David. Greg.
Good night, everyone.